No, that means you can hear me. Okay, everyone can hear me in the back? Okay. Good evening and welcome to the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy's America at 250 Global Perspectives lecture. I'm Dr. Jordan Pellerito, and I'm a program manager with the Kinder Institute, where I also teach our Democracy Lab students. And I want to give a shout out to some of our Democracy Lab students here tonight. Thank you for joining us, and congratulations on your first year with the Kinder Institute. Yeah. I believe we also have some of our Border War ASH students who are led by Drs. Jay Sexton and Kyle Jackson. The team is releasing a podcast called The Past in Pieces, which was up on the slide a few minutes ago. It'll be coming out in the next few weeks, so please be on the lookout for wherever you find your podcasts and give that a listen. They've been really hard at work on that the past few months. Before we kick off tonight's program, I want to share a few housekeeping items. First, we want to give a special word of thanks to our friends at the State Historical Society of Missouri for sponsoring the series. Please also take a moment to silence your cell phones. We will invite you to submit questions on your phone during the program, but please make sure they are on silent. And as you can see, we have a very full house, so if you have an open seat nearby, please let those who may still be walking in, let them know where that is so they can find it and easily join us. Now, before the real introduction, I'm kind of like the walk-up music. I want to say a few words about Dr. Jay Sexton. I took Jay's very first class at Mizzou in 2016, and then he advised both my master's and my PhD, and now he's my boss. So in true Jay style, I have 3 points to properly prepare you for the next hour. First, if you hear a sports analogy or 3, don't worry, you are in the right place. Just nod like you do know why one play from a college basketball game 15 years ago is like a key decision President Harry Truman made. Second, if Jay poses a question to the audience and offers extra credit for the answer, the Kinder Institute has no way of actually giving you extra credit, but we love the participation. Third, Jay is almost always the lone Kansas Jayhawk among countless Missouri Tiger students, staff, and faculty. No, not yet. No. He suffers his fair share of hassling from students and me when he wears a KU hat or shirt on campus. But my final point is that it's Jay, a proud Kansan and KU alum, who has taught and mentored countless Mizzou students throughout the past 10 years and invested great care and direction in the Kinder Institute at a time when the community of American constitutional democracy is more important than ever. The violent border war of the late 1850s inspired our fun modern rivalry, but it's also part of a new legacy, one in which staunch enemies can find common ground in a new crisis. There's plenty of room for our sports rivalry alongside a shared commitment to civic education in a more perfect union, and Jay has spearheaded this new path. But with that, it is still my duty as a true daughter to properly set the tone for this event, so please join me in an M-I-Z. Now, at each of our lectures, we invite some of our students to help with the formal introduction, so I'm pleased to turn it over to Ben Wharton and Mason Andrews, who are part of our MA cohort studying Atlantic history and politics. They worked closely together last fall as teaching assistants in Jay's Global History of the Civil War class. So please join me in welcoming Ben and Mason.
Hello all, and thank you for joining us here today for the penultimate Kinder Institute America at 250 lecture. This time, as you can see from the board, focusing on the view from home. In that sense, I suppose, there's no better person to introduce this lecture than Kinder's own Dr. Jay Sexton, a Midwest native and, as you just heard, alumni from that place out west. However, it's also, I think, fitting for Mason and I to introduce Dr. Sexton tonight, as what you may not know, is that Jay is a naturalised Brit. After finishing his PhD at Oxford, he taught there for over a decade, becoming an emeritus fellow at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, and then returning here to be the Richard Kinder Nancy Chair of Constitutional Democracy. In many ways, Jay's internationalism sits at the heart of his work, having written on the global perspective of Lincoln, the role of international finance in the US Civil War, and the Monroe Doctrine. However, if you ask any of his students, or frankly a first-year me revising for my exams, he's better known as a man who just won't stop talking about steam.
As Ben mentioned, we are in some ways the ideal people to introduce Dr. Sexton, not to brag. The first time I met Ben was at a 500-year-old Oxford college. I found myself there because of Jay. Indeed, the first time I spoke with Dr. Sexton at length, he was interviewing me for the Kinder Institute's Oxford Fellowship, which took me to Corpus Christi College, Ben's alma mater. Ben, meanwhile, knew Jay not as an interviewer, but as the author of some awfully long and awfully insightful books, which feature a lot of steam. Since then, Ben and I have had the incredible opportunity to also call Jay boss, working as teaching assistants for his class on the global history of the Civil War. In that time, Ben and I have become not only coworkers, but friends, bickering about whether or not to spell color with a U, very frequent one that, and jokingly applying the Sexton hypothesis, that it's always the infrastructure, to our class readings. In this way, Jay Sexton has allowed the two of us to form exactly the sort of transatlantic connection on which he's so keen, and which will no doubt come up in his talk today. That talk begins here at home and focuses on an event that should be familiar to all those living here in Columbia, the Kansas-Missouri border war. Following up on his earlier border war presentation, Jay will describe the profound devastation and incredible change which this singularly violent conflict wrought on the Kansas-Missouri borderland.
The border war, however, has implications well beyond the 300 miles that divide these two states. The memories of violence that came to define the region helped produce some of America's most essential leaders in World War II. President Truman and Eisenhower, along with General Bradley, helped shape the modern world and all called these states home. So too have these states themselves been at the forefront of the Cold War and throughout world history, hosting both Sir Winston Churchill's famous remarks and now the US B-2 fleet. Through these dual lenses, Dr. Sexton will show how a history with deep roots at home has branched across the Atlantic and onto the world. Following this presentation, Joel Rhodes, Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri, will join him on stage to continue the conversation. If you have any questions, please scan the QR code on your program, and please do give Jay a tough time. That said, I hope you will join us both in welcoming Dr. Jay Sexton to the stage.
Oh, well, hi, everybody. Thank you, Jordan, very much, and Mason and Ben, thank you. And thanks, everyone, for coming. It's been so awesome to see how much engagement we've had this semester with this series. And shout out to all of you for showing up and being interested in learning about the American past and how other people think about the American past. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the Kansas-Missouri borderlands. I'm going to tell you, and it's the region circled on the map, why this is the most consequential place in America's 250-year history. That was not supposed to be a joke. There's jokes later. I'm dead serious. This is the most consequential place in America's 250-year history. That's our starting point. But before I do that, if you'll indulge me, I want to say a few words why it's the most important place in the world to me. I was born on the region's western edge in Salina, Kansas. My love of history started locally. As a little boy, I was in the Civil War, the Union Civil War reenactment group. I was a drummer boy. I took school trips to the nearby Eisenhower Library and Museum in Abilene. My first history job was at the Truman Archive, the Truman Library in Independence. I had that job while attending that other university. I wasn't going to say it, but the cat's totally out of the bag now. But there is a Rip Van Winkle element to my story. After graduating from KU, I moved to the United Kingdom for 20 years. My partner, Julie, and I, we went, as you heard, totally native. We took British citizenship. We raised two daughters with accents different from our own. We put down roots, had no intentions of leaving, and never would have were it not for the creation of the Kinder Institute here at the University of Missouri. Returning home turned out to be the best move that we ever made. Lovely community, lovely university here. Yeah. But like Rip Van Winkle waking from that long sleep, when I returned, things looked different. It wasn't just that the Midwest of the Trump era was different from the Midwest of the 1990s, though that was certainly the case. It was also that this region's history, which I knew so well, now looked different when I viewed it from an outsider's perspective. The familiar now looked strange. This lecture is about what our region's history looks like when we view it from the outside in. So let's begin with the moment of triumph. July 1945, the end of World War II, President Harry Truman, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, and General Omar Bradley. Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, the largest fighting force in U.S. history, were gathered in Berlin. Never have there been three more powerful people crammed in the back of a convertible. These three were on their way to a ceremony in which they would raise the very American flag that had been flying over the U.S. Capitol on December 7th, 1941. Yet beneath this triumph were scars from the past. Each of these men was connected to one of the darkest chapters in American history, the violent anarchy that engulfed the Kansas-Missouri borderlands in the mid-19th century. Truman, of course, descended from pro-Confederate slaveholders in Jackson County. As a young politician, he courted votes from those guerrillas who had fought with William Quantrill in the 1860s. Eisenhower's story was very different. His parents were pacifist German-American immigrants with Union sympathies who resettled from the east to Abilene, Kansas shortly after the war. Young Ike grew up in Abilene, listening to the town's many Union veterans telling combat stories. Bradley, last but not least, came from Randolph County, Missouri. He grew up just a few miles from the blood-stained fields of the 1864 Centralia Massacre. His family straddled both sides of the conflict. One grandfather fought in blue, the other in gray. The border war, as it had come to be called, still cast a shadow more than 80 years later. It began in the 1850s as a morally charged struggle over slavery in Kansas before descending into a cycle of retaliatory violence in which political cause gave way to anarchy. The 1863 Lawrence Massacre, when Quantrill's guerrillas murdered roughly 180 men and boys, remains one of the deadliest mass killings of innocent civilians in all of American history. You might know that the Union responded with General Order Number 11. In just 15 days, 20,000 civilians in western Missouri were driven from their homes. Among the refugees was Martha, that's Truman's mother, then just a young girl of 11 years of age. Note the painting by Truman in this. This is actually an image from a video. We're going to return to that painting and three other paintings, four in total, from local artists who capture the essence of a region defined by political violence. Now, as we approach America at 250, at a moment in which American democracy once again is on the precipice of political violence, it's worth returning to the history of this interior region. No place in American history has embodied the extremes more so than the Kansas-Missouri borderlands. In the 19th century, this was where the Civil War started and where the violence fell most severely on civilians. Yet a century later, this same place had evolved into a dynamic core of American power. It produced the leading general in 2 world wars, successive presidents who oversaw the creation of the American-led global order, extensive Cold War military infrastructure, including almost 200 ballistic missile silos and extensive interstates. And last but not least, most important of all, a political regime that checked extremism, balanced interests, and sustained bipartisan internationalism for decades. When viewed from a global vantage, this is the headline of the Kansas-Missouri borderlands. Its astonishing transformation from 19th century basket case to core of 20th century power. And what we're going to do in the next 40 minutes is we're going to trace that in microcosm, America's path from failed state to global power, and then we're going to end by getting into our own moment when American constitutional democracy is once again on shaky ground. Does that sound all right? All right. So, let's start in the beginning. 1776, but not with the founding fathers in tights on the East Coast. We're talking about the Kansas-Missouri borderlands. The first chapter of our story is about population. It's about colonization. At the time of the American founding, the Atlantic world was experiencing explosive population growth. Europe's population surged. Benjamin Franklin would often boast about how America's population would double every 20 years. Yet here, in the lower Missouri River Valley, the population barely grew. To be clear, this was no empty space. This, of course, was indigenous country. And this slide represents the relational position and size among the peoples of this region. As you can tell, the Osage were the dominant power. They had a population estimated in 1800 of about 6,000. They controlled much of the Missouri River Basin and extended influence into what is now eastern Kansas. But compared to the larger indigenous powers of the plains, the Lakota to the north and the Comanche to the south, the indigenous peoples of the Missouri-Kansas corridor lacked a single native power able to block large-scale European settlement. Yet the headline of European settlement at this time was also its limits. France, as you probably know, claimed Missouri as part of Louisiana, founding St. Louis in 1764, but the French were focused on trade, not settlement. Spain, which took over the land title in 1763, sought to encourage and incentivize settlement from the Ohio Valley, yet only a few settlers came in the coming decades. In short, there was no precedent for what followed. In the second decade of the 19th century, the 18 teens, the region experienced explosive American colonization. The Boone's Lick region, and Boone's Lick is the area where we are today, central Missouri, a large bit of the central part of the state, became one of the fastest growing places in the United States. Its population went from a few dozen settlers in the late 18th century to tens of thousands by 1820. In fact, the growth of central Missouri in this period outpaced that of 7 of the 9 gold rush counties in the heyday of the 49ers in California. That's the scale of colonization we're talking about. Two forces drove this transformation. The first was America's imperial state. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was just the beginning. To make it real, the federal government had to liquidate indigenous land holdings. The key figure here is, of course, William Clark. Now, you probably know William Clark as an explorer with sidekick Meriwether Lewis, but his greatest significance is to be found in his long career as a territorial authority in this region. He negotiated some 36 treaties that reduced indigenous land holdings. At the same time, the United States built a chain of military forts to secure control. First, Fort Osage, east of Kansas City, then Fort Leavenworth, Fort Scott, and on as time went. The land rush was also a military occupation. The second force driving this was economic integration. Boone's Lick was, of course, connected to St. Louis, but that was not all. In 1821, William Becknell, his expedition opened the new Santa Fe Trail, linking the region to a commercial network stretching to northern Mexico. By the 1840s, river towns near the Kansas-Missouri confluence, St. Joe, Weston, and Independence had become bustling inland ports. The region, in other words, was now both a site of American colonization and a staging ground for overland migration along the Santa Fe, Oregon, and California trails. So we're seeing really fast change in the early 19th century. Second bit of the story is, of course, about slavery. The rapid conquest of Missouri showcased the power of the new republic, but it also revealed its greatest weakness, the inability of its political system to resolve the moral question of slavery. Now, slavery had deep roots in this region. The French first established it on the western banks of the Mississippi in the 1720s, and a lot of those American settlers in Boone's Lick brought enslaved peoples with them. Yet it's important to note that Missouri was never the Deep South, as the map of the slave density population reveals. Slavery was never a dominant institution here. It shaped Missouri's economy and its social hierarchy, absolutely, but it existed alongside a rapidly growing population of small farmers, immigrants, and traders. Missouri thus became the site of one of the 19th century's great political experiments, posed as a question: could slavery survive in a region increasingly shaped by free labor migration? Now, the first test, as you probably know, PTSD from your AP history or your history class, came with the Missouri Crisis of 1819 and 20, when Congress debated Missouri's admission to the Union and Northern lawmakers sought to restrict slavery, prompting white Missourians to denounce federal interference. The ensuing compromise eventually admits Missouri as a slave state while banning slavery north of the line 3630, the black line on the map. The crisis passed, but tensions remained. Missouri became, in effect, a slaveholding peninsula bordered by free territory. Enslaved Missourians fled toward free territory, while incoming migrants, especially anti-slavery Germans, reshaped, remolded the state's politics. Here were the roots of Bleeding Kansas. Bleeding Kansas was just as much about the future of slavery in Missouri. Pro-slavery Missourians, led by Senator David Rice Atchison, concluded that a free Kansas would doom slavery in Missouri. In fact, it was Atchison, he was the big hardliner of the 1850s, who pressured Stephen Douglas to explicitly repeal the Missouri Compromise in his 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act. Another PTSD thing from your high school history. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, of course, reopens the question of whether Kansas would be free territory, which it was after the Missouri Compromise, or possibly slave territory through the formulation of popular sovereignty, that the settlers in the region would get to vote and determine for themselves. The result of this Kansas-Nebraska Act was a colonization race, a race between those for and against slavery. As tensions mounted, the moral struggle fused with everyday grievances, land disputes, religious rivalries, business competition, personal feuds, and this is what made the situation so combustible. Ordinary, everyday conflicts could metastasize into ideological showdowns at the drop of a hat. Just consider how the violence in Kansas first began. In late 1855, a land dispute in eastern Kansas turned deadly when Franklin Coleman shot dead Charles Dow. Now, this tragically was not an uncommon occurrence in the 19th century West, but here it had a twist. Coleman was pro-slavery and Dow was a free stater. What would have remained a local quarrel quickly escalated into a political confrontation as allies of both men interpreted the killing through the wider struggle of slavery. Armed groups soon gathered near the Free State anti-slavery hub of Lawrence in what became known as the Wakarusa War, an early standoff showing how quickly private disputes could turn into political violence. Meanwhile, elections became another flashpoint. Outnumbered, pro-slavery forces turned to intimidation and fraud. This is the era of the Missouri border ruffians, as they were called, crossing into Kansas on Election Day to influence the vote. Violence peaked in May of 1856 when a pro-slavery sheriff led a mob into Lawrence, backed by David Rice Atchison himself, a sitting senator, backed this expedition, and they destroyed the 2 printing presses in the town and the Free State Hotel. Now what happens next is the local violence spreads outside of the Kansas territory. In Washington, Senator Charles Sumner denounced what he called the crime against Kansas in a decorum-breaking speech, which led South Carolinian Preston Brooks to respond by brutally caning Sumner days later. Back in the Kansas territory, John Brown turns up the lever of violence when he and his followers kill 5 pro-slavery settlers near Pottawatomie Creek. By that summer, there's open warfare, organized open warfare by paramilitary militia organizations. Now, if a civil war is defined as the sustained and systematic use of violence to achieve political goals, then the American Civil War can be said to have begun in Kansas in May of 1856. Our region, in short, was the spark that led to the greatest calamity in America's 250-year history. A little more violence, and then we'll turn to happier topics. One of the shrewdest observers of the violence in Kansas was an Englishman, a traveling British journalist, a guy called T.H. Gladstone, a correspondent for the largest newspaper in the world at the time, the London Times. Drawing from his knowledge of European history, and Gladstone knew almost nothing about the United States. In fact, he arrives in the Kansas territory literally the day of the sacking of Lawrence. He just happens to arrive in that day, and he starts writing dispatches to the London Times, and he interprets what he sees not through his understanding of America, but through his understanding of European history and especially the French Revolution. He calls what's happening in Kansas not a border war, but the American Reign of Terror, after, of course, the French Reign of Terror in the 1790s. And his words would prove prophetic. When the Civil War began, when the National Civil War began in 1861, Missouri remained a Union state. And if you only remember one thing from tonight, please remember this, that for every Confederate soldier from the state of Missouri during the Civil War, there were 3 Union soldiers. This was a Union state. Within it, of course, was a hardened and violent pro-Confederate minority. Kansas, by contrast, became one of the most militant Republican states in the Union. Its troops would have the highest casualty rate of troops from any state in the Union. Led by figures like James Lane and Charles Jennison, many of these so-called Jayhawkers were driven as much by revenge and plunder as they were by principle. In the autumn of 1861, right at the beginning of the war, Lane, who's like Atchison, Lane is also a senator, becomes a senator. Lane led an ill-disciplined Jayhawker invasion of western Missouri that left dozens of towns in ruins, notably Osceola and Dayton. This campaign was like the equivalent of 20, maybe 25 1856 sackings of Lawrence. Meanwhile, in response, pro-Confederate Missourians formed guerrilla bands called bushwhackers. Some, like Jesse James, first one on your left, came from slaveholding families seeking revenge. Others were weird kind of chameleons. William Quantrill, he started off riding with the Jayhawkers before having a change of heart. Still others were little more than sociopathic killers. I'm talking here about Bloody Bill Anderson on the far edge, who made a necklace of human ears that he reaped from his victims. Slavery lay at the heart of the conflict. The region became an early testing ground for emancipation. In 1861, Union General John Fremont attempted to free the slaves of rebel Missourians. Lincoln rescinded this order, but he took note of the military rationale for abolition, which he would use a year later in the Emancipation Proclamation. The region also saw the first combat by African American troops. The 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, based out of Fort Scott, but comprised mostly of fugitive slaves from western Missouri, fought valiantly at Island Mound in October of 1862. This is almost 9 full months before the much more celebrated 54th Massachusetts African American Regiment sees its first combat. Indeed, if you've ever seen the movie Glory, I don't know if anyone's seen the movie, one of the great war movies of modern times, it should have been about these troops, and Morgan Freeman should have played the role of Captain William Matthews, who has a very interesting struggle to try to get his credentials as a captain in the Army, facing the racism. Ultimately does, but it happens after the war. Now, this was not a conventional war. It was fought by neighbors who knew one another. It was often fought at night. The combatants were often drunk. Civilians lived in fear. It was not only a guerrilla war, it was also a total war of communities and households. Women played a central role in sustaining the guerrilla effort, particularly on the bushwhacker side. They hid weapons, relayed messages, and coordinated support for fighters in the field. Union authorities understood this. The key figure here is General Thomas Ewing, a Union commander in the region and brother-in-law of William Tecumseh Sherman, and he shared Sherman's view that war should be held. In 1863, Ewing ordered the arrest of women suspected of aiding guerrillas, confining them to a makeshift jail in Kansas City. The building tragically and in an accident collapsed, killing 4 prisoners, including Bloody Bill's sister. The conflict now entered its most horrific phase. In August of 1863, this is when William Quantrill leads those 450 guerrillas into Lawrence at dawn. They were carrying lists of prominent Jayhawkers to target, but the attackers quickly descended into a frenzy of killing, executing every man and boy they could find. When it ended, Lawrence lay in ruins and 180 civilians were dead. The Union's response was, of course, General Order Number 11, which forced tens of thousands of civilians to evacuate most of 4 counties of western Missouri. Even loyal residents were compelled to abandon their homes as Union troops confiscated property and burned farmhouses. The region became known as the Burnt District of western Missouri. Its population cratered from around 40,000 to less than 4,000. It is one of the least known humanitarian disasters in American history, but we are fortunate that it was captured in a classic of 19th century art. Here's Missouri artist George Caleb Bingham. Now, Bingham is pro-Union, like most Missourians, but he's anti-Ewing. He's opposed to General Order Number 11. And his painting depicts the Scorched Earth campaign. It captures the totality of the violence. And what I take from the painting is how it merges home front and war zone. You can barely see, but you can see that the parlor is in the battlefield as the arsonist soldiers move into the house. And if you can't see it on that projection, oh my gosh, just go around the corner where it's on display at the State Historical Society of Missouri. It is an amazing painting. Right when you walk into the art gallery, sit there, take it in. Actually painted on a tablecloth. And if you get in the right light, you can see the tablecloth beneath it. Okay, I said that we were going to stop talking about violence. Let's stop for just a second. Let's talk about my favorite thing, the students of the Kinder Institute. Students of the Kinder Institute, the last 2 years, I've been working with a group of students in what's called the ASH program. This is part of our partnership with the Honors College. Shout out to Dean Rempf here. And what we do is we work together on a research project, and we're working on the Kansas-Missouri borderlands. They do research, we exchange our findings, and this year they've been working on their own podcast scripts. So this is the one time you can get out your phone and do that little QR thing. The podcast will soon be released. We have a trailer out there. They'll be coming in the next month or so, but fantastic work from the students. Where are the students on the team? Can you guys stand up? Can you guys stand up? Everyone give them a round of applause. And I mean, what's so cool about it is that, you know, you'll learn more stuff. Even if you know a lot about the border, well, you'll learn more stuff, but what's most important, you'll learn what it means to the next generation. What does it mean to them, this experience? And it all has their own gloss on it. And they're probably rolling their eyes because a lot of what I'm talking about tonight comes from those podcast scripts. And one more shout out, where's Tom Rayfiner? Tom Rayfiner, he's not here, but he's a historian at the State Historical Society, works with the records of the State Historical Society, and he's forgotten more about the border war than all of us have ever learned, so we're grateful to him. Okay, General Order number 11 didn't end the violence. It just pushes it east. So the second biggest massacre of the border war happens the next year, 1864. That's the Centralia massacre. It's on the same order of magnitude as the Lawrence massacre. Appomattox and the end of the National Civil War doesn't end the violence in this region in 1865. Bushwhackers and Jayhawkers feuded on, especially in the volatile cattle towns like Sedalia and Abilene. It was a messy ending to a messy war. Missouri's Reconstruction Constitution of 1865, it imposes a harsh loyalty oath, and this provokes a backlash, even among Unionist Missourians. Most white Missourians soon come to oppose Reconstruction and black enfranchisement. After the war is when Quantrill's followers begin to hold their annual reunions in Independence. That's the picture on the left. Figures like Jesse James are recast as folk heroes, modern-day Robin Hoods. And by the 1880s, does anyone know who that is? I was going to offer a point of extra credit. That is John Marmaduke, Confederate general. Then he's elected governor of Missouri in 1884. He loves his Confederate uniform. And when he's elected in 1884, you could say that Missouri had become more pro-Confederate in the 1880s than it had been in the 1860s. But the persistence of old divisions was not the only story. For in the decades after the war, the region is completely transformed. And the headline of this transformation is economic. Now, this is where we would normally talk about Kansas City, the rise of Kansas City, the first bridge across the Missouri River in 1869 depicted on that drawing, the ballooning population thanks to immigration, the bulging stockyards, the overall role of the city as a gateway between the Great Plains and a globalizing world system. But let's not talk about Kansas City. The big cities get enough love. Let's chart this transformation by talking about two small towns on the opposite poles of our region, Salina and Centralia. In central Kansas, two developments drove change: the arrival of the Kansas Pacific Railroad and turkey red wheat, introduced after the war by German-speaking immigrants from the Volga region, my ancestors who first came here shortly after the American Civil War. This hardy winter crop thrived on the plains, creating a vast wheat belt that made Kansas one of the world's leading wheat producers. Salina, positioned on the railroad and in the middle of this new wheat belt, emerged as a center for milling and grain export. As it grew, memory of the old guerrilla violence to its east receded. Consider the meaning of the word Jayhawk in Salina by 1900. Once synonymous with lawlessness and guerrilla warfare, the label was repurposed as the name of Salina's most successful export, the ingenious Jayhawk haystacker. You find these on farms deep into the 20th century across Africa and Asia. They were still around, a remarkable contraption that transformed how wheat would be stacked. At the other pole stands Centralia, site of that horrific 1864 massacre. Anyone from Centralia? Ooh, okay. Well, then you need to know about the small towns. Centralia, by the turn of the century, became a leading producer of a new product. They were called land anchors, used to stabilize utility poles. It exported these products across the British Empire. It was integrated into the British imperial economy. As Salina shipped wheat and haystackers, Centralia shipped industrial hardware. It soon had a new identity at home as well. After traveling through Asia, the town's leading family, the Chance family, built an amazing replica garden behind their home, complete with Chinese flora, a grotto, and a Japanese pergola. For much of the 20th century, it was the Chance Gardens, not the massacre site, which was the town's principal attraction. As the region changed, so too did its memory. Unlike Civil War battlefields in the East, very few monuments were erected here. It's one of the great mysteries why we have no monuments to the civilian casualties of the border war. Instead of memorializing the dead, it was a new tradition that came to shape collective memory of the border war, starting in 1891. Who knows what I'm going to say here? Football, the border war football game. Now, in the spirit of civic unity, civic unity, I of course picked the 1910 game because it ends in a tie. It's actually kind of hard to find a Missouri result in the early era of the border war games, but I found the tie. Fun fact, 5-5, you're like, how weird is that? Field goal and safety? No, in those days, touchdowns were only worth 5, just as a try in rugby was only worth 5, and of course, football comes from rugby. Now, the symbolism of the border war, as it came to be called, I mean, it's really strained, the historical symbolism, because the Columbia Tigers, right, who Mizzou's named after, the Columbia Tigers had been a Union-aligned militia, and they were on the same side as the Jayhawkers. Yet the rivalry reshaped memory, turning guerrilla chaos into a regulated, good-spirited contest with clear sides, rules, and most of all, a final whistle. The annual border war games simplified the past, stripping it of its complexity. And we say today that the game reveals how much Kansans and Missourians hate one another, but these original border war games functioned in the exact opposite way. They were a form of amnesia, a form of reconciliation. As the 20th century progressed, those who actually remembered the real violence came to do so in a very particular way. They emphasized the dangers of political extremism. Nowhere was this more evident than in the evolving memory of John Brown. Now, African Americans continue to honor Brown as an abolitionist hero, but many Kansas elites came to view him as a dangerous demagogue. The most powerful expression of this reinterpretation came in a masterpiece of 20th century art. So this is our second work of art. John Stuart Curry's 1942 Tragic Prelude. This is a mural in the Kansas State House in Topeka. Curry's Brown is larger than life. He's a superhuman who altered the course of Kansas history. But he also stands as a warning of fanatic zealotry. He's wild-eyed, an ungodly Christ figure conjuring whirlwinds of destruction all around him. Now, Curry, of course, was painting at a time in which demagogues threatened order at home and abroad. And here we arrive at one of this region's greatest achievements, the forging of a new type of politics that marginalized extremists and balanced interest. And if you're looking for the origins of the New Deal, do not look at FDR and East Coast intellectuals. Look right here in the Kansas-Missouri borderlands. Kansas City's New Deal came early in the 1920s. Its foundation was the political machine of Tom Pendergast. It was a corrupt political system, but it was one that forged alliances between immigrant labor and business elites, country farmhands and city intellectuals, and eventually, and most remarkably, African Americans and Old South sympathizers. The master of this new politics was, of course, Harry Truman. He built alliances across class lines and racial divides. Without the support of Kansas City's black editors and voters, Truman would not have ascended up the political ranks. Now, his coalition was a weird conglomeration of bedfellows, but the key to its success were those who were kept at arm's length. Kansas City's New Deal ostracized extremists, above all the Ku Klux Klan, which was, of course, a major force in the politics of the 1920s. Across the border in Kansas, we can see a very similar story unfolding, this time within the state's Republican coalition. William Allen White of Emporia was the leading voice of moderate republicanism. He too fought off the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s in Kansas, and he opposed extremist movements, most notably the 1938 Senate campaign of Gerald Winrod, a fascist sympathizing preacher from Wichita. Winrod comes within a whisker of getting a Senate seat, and it's William Allen White who stops that from happening. Now, White's opposition to fascism led him to become a vocal advocate of aiding Britain against Nazi aggression. Though he raced ahead of Kansas public opinion here, he laid the groundwork for the liberal internationalist takeover of the Republican Party by native son Dwight Eisenhower in 1952. The region, once synonymous with extremism and guerrilla violence, became the core of a dynamic new political order. The brilliance of the New Deal was its ability to adapt. It might have started with the corrupt Pendergast machine, but the 1940 Missouri Plan strengthened judicial independence. Truman, of course, descended from pro-Confederate slaveholders, but when he became the commander-in-chief, he desegregated the Army. Meanwhile, in Topeka, the NAACP's legal challenge that culminated in Brown versus Board of Education jump-started the most consequential reform of the 20th century, the Civil Rights Movement. So here's my point. In the 19th century, this region exported violence and civil war. In the 20th century, it modeled the dynamic politics of the New Deal. This is why I'm saying it's one of the most consequential places in the United States. Okay, just a little bit more, but we've got to talk about global power now. The region's New Deal was unmistakably local, but it developed global horizons. Isolationism, of course, ran deep. There was much opposition to the League of Nations and involvement in European affairs deep into the 1930s. The quote from a young Truman says it all. But the tide soon shifted. As the region integrated into international markets, recognition from abroad became a source of civic pride. Who's the first global celebrity of the Kansas-Missouri borderlands? Someone who's known around the world. I was going to offer extra credit. General John J. Pershing, born in Laclede, Missouri, northwest Missouri. Now, his first childhood memory that he writes about in his memoirs is a traumatic one. As a boy, he watched bushwhackers raid his family's pro-union home while his distraught and panicked mother shielded him from the violence. He would spend the rest of his career promoting the order and stability absent in his childhood home. After commanding the American Expeditionary Force in World War I, Kansas City seized the moment. Civic leaders leveraged Pershing's fame to fundraise for the Liberty Memorial, the nation's first major monument to the war. The opening ceremony placed Kansas City on the world map. Now, though the region had been inclined toward isolation, this changed after Pearl Harbor. Once again, the region's art illustrated the shift. Thomas Hart Benton shattered the illusion that the Heartland farmhouse was safe from foreign dangers in his Year of Peril series. This painting, titled Invasion, also from 1942, portrays the region becoming a burnt district once again, this time at the hands of rapacious foreign enemies. And once again, if you can't appreciate the art on the slide, you just need to go across the street to the State Historical Society, where you can see the remarkable original. Military mobilization shifted and solidified this international turn. The chain of 19th century forts expanded into a massive civilian military complex. Fort Riley ballooned in size. New airfields appeared near Salina, Topeka, and of course Sedalia. Training facilities, munitions depots, POW camps all dotted the landscape. The region's economy boomed. On its southwestern periphery, a mammoth aviation industry was born. 30,000 workers, half of whom were women, the original Rosie the Riveters, worked round the clock at Wichita's Boeing Plant 2, producing nearly half of America's B-29 Superfortress Armada. This transformation continued into the Cold War. Atlas missile silos were dug across Kansas. My grandmother worked at an Atlas silo. Minutemen sites were spread across western Missouri. The landscape that once launched wagon trains now became a hub of the Cold War's nuclear geography. It also became a hub of the new interstate network, which had long been promoted by regional leaders like Pershing, Eisenhower, and Truman. It is thus fitting that the first completed stretch of the interstate system was right here in western Missouri, I-70. If you haven't stopped at the rest stop, mile marker 57, and seen the little historical marker, now you know what you're going to do next time you drive to Kansas City. Now, this was an unusually prosperous era in the region's history, but its gains were, of course, uneven. The new interstates enabled white flight and new forms of de facto segregation, while the opportunities the war opened for women were narrowed as the patriarchal order reasserted itself after 1945. But for better and for worse, this was the region's high tide. The place scarred by civil war now took the lead in shaping the American century. A Missouri Democrat, followed by a Kansas Republican, presided over the consolidation of the American century. Both presidents carried lessons of the region with them into global leadership. Truman often said this, that his support for the Marshall Plan came from his family's experience in attempting to recover in the burnt district without any federal support. Eisenhower often talked about how the center of the world would revolve around Kansas City. He said that the proudest thing he could claim is that he was from Abilene. That kills me as someone from Salina, but it's close enough. Both leaders made the case for American international leadership in plain language that resonated in a region once known for isolationism. Truman's 1953 farewell address, I think this is the most important 20th century speech by an American president. Truman's farewell address argued that the interconnected nature of the world meant that America could not go back to isolationism. It could not wall itself off from the rest of the world. Global leadership, he argued, was now a civic duty. At the same time, both presidents carried forward their region's suspicion of centralized power and militarism. Truman thwarted the ambitions of General MacArthur, while Eisenhower warned of the rise of the military-industrial complex in his own farewell address in 1961. But the true measure of the region's internationalism wasn't about what the leaders said. It can be found in its popular legitimacy. consider the story of nearby Fulton. It was in this small town that Winston Churchill, of course, delivers his famous 1946 Iron Curtain speech, which helps define the battle lines of the Cold War. But the more important, the more revealing story to the region came after Churchill had left. Determined to place Fulton on the world map, local leaders raised funds for an extraordinary project: the relocation of a 17th century church designed by Christopher Wren from bombed-out East London. Stone by stone, the church was dismantled, shipped across the Atlantic, and rebuilt in Fulton. The tiger loves the story of the church. Okay? How many of you have been to the Churchill Shrine in? Absolutely. If you haven't, you really have to. Completed in 1969, and then the sections of the Berlin Wall there added after the end of the Cold War. Fulton's Churchill Shrine now stands as a curious anachronism, an artifact of a bygone era when a small Missouri town celebrated its global connections. Judged by recent elections, the voters of Callaway County now want to build walls, not to tear them down. Yet this reversal fits the history of a region marked by seismic change and sudden reversals. Once defined by the conflict over slavery and later central to the New Deal and American power, the region now reflects the dominant trend line of our own era: the contested concentration of power and the breakdown of national unity. You can see this, of course, in the economy. For much of the 20th century, the New Deal order balanced agriculture, industry, and small-town commerce. Today, that order has collapsed. Wealth clusters in Kansas City, especially Johnson County, Kansas, one of the richest counties in the American interior, while the decline of the family farm has hollowed out much of the countryside. The region's relationship to national power has also changed. In the mid-20th century, the civilian-military complex tied local communities to the national security state. Today, that connection has narrowed. Hard power is concentrated in a handful of mega bases, especially Fort Riley, home of the 1st Infantry Division, and Whiteman Air Force Base in Knob Noster, Missouri, which houses the nation's fleet of B-2 bombers. Military power defines these base communities, but it is invisible in the wider region, apart from flyovers on game days. I bet most of us here go about our daily lives without thinking about the fact that the most sophisticated concentration of nuclear-capable air power in human history is cocooned within Whiteman's secure perimeter, just an 85-minute drive that way. Our astonishing military power is increasingly untethered from everyday civic life, and I find this to be one of the most ominous developments of our time. Some of the region's old military complex is now a destabilizing force. Outside of Independence stands the Lake City Army Ammunition Plant, built, of course, during World War II, and still one of the largest producers of small arms ammunition in the United States. Most of its output serves legitimate military and law enforcement needs, but it has recently expanded commercial production, mostly for AR-15 rifles. Lake City shell casings have been found at the shootouts of Mexican cartels and tragically at the sites of school shootings in the United States. Political leadership has shifted as well. In the mid-20th century, this region produced Omar Bradley and Dwight D. Eisenhower, leaders who embodied restraint, discipline, public duty. I'm not saying they're perfect. Don't say Sexton's saying that Omar Bradley's perfect, but I am saying they put country before party. They put country before self. That ethic stands in sharp contrast to our political class today. Once again, a local artist, last painting, a local artist has captured an important shift. Here's Kansas City artist Archie Scott Gauber's 2025 painting, just a year old, Ready, Fire, Aim, a work that dissects the jingoistic grammar of our era's gilded patriotism. Just as Curry's Brown was a warning for his era, I read Gauber's painting as a warning for our own age in which we are drifting ever closer to the precipice of political violence. Let me end. The history of the Kansas-Missouri borderlands captures the overall headline of America at 250. This is the headline of America at 250. Our nation's democratic experiment failed before it triumphed. In this anniversary year, let's remember that American history is not an unbroken story of success. And nowhere is that clearer than in our region, where political order has been built, burnt to the ground, reconstituted, propagated around the world, and now shows signs of fracture once again. The task ahead is not to restore a vanished past, but to build what comes next. In 10 years of teaching students here at the University of Missouri and at the Kinder Institute in the History Department makes me confident, makes me certain that the leaders of the future will be better than those of the present. But before they take over, I hope they won't mind one last word from a professor who loves this place. Never forget what happened here in the 19th century. Thank you very much. Joel, would you like to come in?
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Joel Rhodes. I'm the Executive Director of the State Historical Society of Missouri. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Always great to help out our friends at the Kinder Institute. But in the interest of full disclosure, I really wanted the word interlocutor on my CV. So that was a little value added there. So as we go through this tonight, I just want to remind you that we've got some questions here for Jay. And you can add questions by scanning that QR code here. And we'll get to as many of them as we can. There are a couple of things I want to say, though, just kind of second what you said. My wife and Jeannie and I, we've been here in Columbia for, not quite a year. And it's absolutely amazing to see the intellectual curiosity of the community. The people that come out for things here, down at our place on Elm Street, it's really inspiring. The second thing, as a Cold War era historian, I think one of the most important stories of the era is that during the most, I think, arguably dangerous years in human history, the country turns to a man from Missouri and a man from Kansas for leadership. So, all right, well, we'll get right into it here. And I think probably instead of just jumping in, we'll wade in very gingerly with a couple of softball questions. And so the first question from the audience is, Jay, how do you see the future of America? The idea and the reality. Oh, there's more. How do you see the future of America, both the idea and the reality, given the extent to which the Trump administration has trampled both?
Well, we're starting with the softball question, so that's fantastic. I mean, how do we see the future of the era? And I mean, there is the tendency to focus on the high politics and the actions of the current administration. And I think that there's every reason to do that. But when you look at like a region, as I was doing in the lecture, the high politics don't really tell you all of the changes or all the things that you need to know. I think that the structural changes are key. And at the national level, you ask, why do we have dysfunctional politics? Why are we electing to the highest offices people that don't have the character worthy of those offices? Well, it's not because of the politicians. It's because of the breakdown of some of the civic structures that held the nation together and made it function when it was a functioning nation in periods of the 20th century. So I think that's where you need to start, and you need to think instead of waving your fist at the sky and shouting at the clouds. You think about, well, what is it that you can do to make a difference? How can you become engaged to restore and regenerate the civic bonds that have become so fragmented and fractured in recent years. So, in other words, as I always tell the students, like, look in the mirror, think about what you can do rather than hating what other people are doing. And once everyone starts thinking about that, that's the first step to getting out of this mess.
Good. Second question. Columbia generally, and the State Historical Society specifically, represent a specific regional window into the American story. In your view, what unique lessons does the history of the Midwest offer to the broader national conversation about democracy that might be overlooked by coastal and global narratives?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that, as I say, the headline about this region is change, is seismic change, transformation. And if you step back and you look at the nation as a whole, and you kind of reduce the complexity because you're zooming out, I think it's much easier to try to tell linear stories of progress or of development. It's much easier to tell actually a comforting story about the United States as a place where contest for rights is moving in a general direction. But then when you zoom in and you look at particular places, especially this region, you see that that doesn't actually capture the essence of the history. This is a place that lurches in one direction and then in the opposite direction. It's a place marked by seismic change. And I think if you do that at the local level and you start to understand historical development that way, you can step back and think about how the nation as a whole actually looks different and also is not on such a linear trajectory.
Next question is a two-parter, and as I read through this, I'm thinking of John Roberts a couple days ago, talking about the country has changed, or the country is new, the world is new, the Constitution is not.
Yeah.
Society has changed drastically since the Constitution was drafted. Question one, how does interpretation of the Constitution impact the next generation when they have yet to have the opportunity to interpret it for themselves?
Sorry, Truman running there. caught my eye. I mean, hey, oldest written constitution, continuously operating constitution in the world. Truman likes that. Yeah? All right. He likes the oldest continuously operational constitution in the world. But, I mean, the country is so different from the late 18th century. I mean, we often get asked about originalism. I mean, the first thing to say about originalism is that it would have been real news to the actual founding fathers, because they spent the 1790s, like the same guys that had been at the Constitutional Convention, like after they got out of there, the Constitution's printed, they just start fighting about, oh, that's not what we meant. It wasn't that, it was that. And the process of debating or determining a fixed kind of original public meaning, I mean, the contestation is the story about the Constitution. So I don't think we should be afraid to debate about it. And if you think about originalism as a tactic for adjudicating contemporary legal disputes, it's one of many that can be used, so long as you go into it with the understanding that you can't immediately know what the answer is going to be, because when you look at the history, there isn't one fixed meaning of the Constitution itself. So I think that the students, if the question was about how should the students relate to this old document, they should look at the old document, think about how it has endured such different times and eras, what are its strategies for governance and for binding together a diverse, what has always been a very diverse nation. But they shouldn't be completely restricted in their intellectual approach to it, that they only need to recapture what was said in 1787 or 1789. That's not really how the Constitution has worked. One more thing about the Supreme Court, of course, Marbury versus Madison, that comes, what, almost 20 years later, 15 years later. The idea that the Supreme Court itself is a co-equal branch of government, that was something that had to be fought and contested and established through a judicial process.
Excellent. I'm still basking in the warm afterglow of Truman's bear hug and goodbye. Anyway, you actually addressed the second part of that question, and you anticipated then the next question. What would the framers have thought of the current brand of originalism? Would the framers have anticipated the current political division amongst the states so as to effectively preclude adoption of constitutional amendments?
I mean, the framers, the first thing you got to know is that these guys were revolutionaries, right? They fought a revolution against Great Britain. They're conservative revolutionaries, so they believe in establishing institutions that will stand the test of time. But they're not opposed to change. In fact, that's the whole story, right? Is that they fought the revolution, they broke from Britain. That was an epochal decision. So I don't think that they would have wanted to fix interpretations for very specific issues. What they're trying to do in the Constitution is establish a workable, functioning framework that could hold the nation together in a very competitive world at the time. I mean, the thing that really need to know about the Constitution is primarily it was conceived as a way of securing American independence. Nobody thought that American independence had been achieved when the Constitution was drafted. Drafting the Constitution, improving the old Articles of Confederation, was a way in which the United States could enhance its power so it could function in a very hostile world. One last point, I mean, the big dilemma, of course, in the late 18th century and in the Constitution is about executive power. It's about, on the one hand, you need to have stronger central power, and it's going to take the form of a president who could conceive of foreign relations. You have to have that so American independence can be secured, but you can't have too strong of a central state or too powerful of a president that acts like a king, which is, of course, why you fought the revolution in the first place. So I think at the heart of the Constitution is walking that tightrope. It's that balancing act of creating a stronger state, but not so strong of a state that you're going to have a second revolution, which is, of course, exactly what happens in the American Civil War.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Franklin's revolutionary comment, "We must hang together, we will certainly hang separately." What is something that you see missing from young people's perspectives on the 250th birthday of the country?
Ooh.
Is there any extra credit perhaps involved with this?
Well, I think that the students, I wouldn't say that the students, because of their age, are all that different from us that aren't that much older than them. I'm not sure that age would be the best way of breaking it down, although that being said, and thinking out loud now, I mean, the students, so say, your 20-year-old student, you've had a very volatile, formative adolescence at the sort of macro level, from the political volatility, even though they wouldn't have experienced the 2008 financial collapse. I mean, we're still experiencing the aftershocks of that. Strange political elections, of course, COVID, now international conflict and war. So it's a very different formative experience. So I wonder how that's probably shaped how students look back at the past. Do they see it as more tranquil, or do they look back, and as good historians, what they probably will do is look back and say, hey, there's always been lots of conflict and contestation. The stuff that we're experiencing isn't that new. So I rather suspect that when people write about America 25 years from now, there will be a lot more about conflict, social conflict, political conflict, than there is in the history books that I was raised reading.
I appreciate this next question. You and I share some sensibilities. Is there something to be said about the mutual violence and loss in both Kansas and Missouri that has created a unique bond between us that are not seen in other states?
I mean, I think so. I think so. I think probably less now. I mean, as I was saying about the border war football game, like how that functioned back 100 years ago was so different from today. It really was what helped kind of bring and heal the wounds from the past. And part of that was just by airbrushing the history out, making Missouri seem like it was a solid bushwhacker, pro-Confederate state, transforming the Missouri Tigers into like a Confederate unit when that wasn't the case, and Kansas becoming across-the-board Jayhawker place, which of course was also not true. There was slaveholding Kansans, and there was conflict in Kansas in the 1850s. So I think that it was about how do you recover from a violent past, and the conflict I deal with is like every bone in my body wants there to be like a reckoning, Truth and Reconciliation Commission like you have in South Africa. Like that's what you need to do to get past a violent past or an unjust past. But the story of this region is the opposite. It makes me uncomfortable, but it's like you forget the past, or you don't build the monuments. Instead, you have this social ritual of a football game, which has really little resonance with the past itself, but it helps the people move on. So that makes me feel awkward and uncomfortable, but that is one of the stories of how this region recovers from the violent past. One more thing, of course, how does it recover? It's just new people. I mean, so few of the people from the 1850s and 60s were still around, or they were dwarfed in proportion to all the immigrants and the migrants. So the place really is transformed and changed.
Yeah. I'm encouraged by the reconciliation of the two states, and then I walk downtown here in the district, and I see some oftentimes fairly vulgar expressions of hatred against the University of Kansas tacked on apartment windows. So, but it is what it is.
Well, I'm sure you'd see that in Lawrence as well.
I can't imagine. Are there other U.S. state borderlands that we should look to?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, in some ways, the state lines are kind of irrelevant when you're thinking about this sort of a thing. And one thing I didn't say in the lecture tonight, but someone might ask, why is this a distinct region? And one of the reasons why is that if you're moving west across North America, this is the last region with adequate rainfall to sustain large-scale agriculture. So it gives it a sort of coherence, a geographic coherence that the state lines really have little resemblance to. But I would look at places that, anywhere within Appalachia, and how the Appalachian Mountains and the Appalachian culture and economy fits in to the lowland areas. That's always going to be an interesting thing to look at, where there's conflict and tensions. That's kind of weirdly the same story there. Those were pro-Union pockets along the Appalachian Mountains. Those were Union troops raised within the Confederacy, but now they're the places where you probably would be most likely to see the Confederate flag being flown in those regions. So it's like a complete shift and transformation of political sensibility. But I would look there. That would be one place I'd look. And then in the West Coast, I mean, the borderlands on the far West Coast between the United States and Canada, really interesting contested space because you're dealing with two national borders there. So great question, whoever asked that. Very nerdy question, but great question.
Very good. So as these questions are popping up, some are disappearing, and there was one that was asking you to weigh in on your prediction for next year's KU Mizzou football game, but that question has disappeared magically from.
I got this year's right, by the way. I said that Kansas would be ahead at halftime, and then would lose. I got it right. So everybody was happy. My prediction was right, and the Missouri fans can be happy.
The question disappeared, but it got answered anyway, so that worked out well. So I'm told this is the final question.
Okay.
Can you elaborate a little bit about the podcast episodes, what they're about, what the content is?
I mean, guys, really want you to listen to those. The students all kind of do a deep dive into a specific thing. So there's one on Bingham's painting, General Order Number 11. There's one on black troops, when I was talking about the black troops. There's one on civilians and how civilians are pressured to pick a side. That has great music throughout. We commissioned a musician who does like old-fashioned fiddle music, and so it really has a professional feel to it. And I think this might just have to be an ongoing thing, because we have, I think, 15 episodes in this first series, and we've just scratched the surface of it. So please download that and support our students by doing it, and it's great work. Shout out to the students one more time.
And I thank you all for joining us, and in that spirit, a shout out to Dr. Jay Sexton again.
Thank you. Thank you, Joel.
And as Jay suggested, please come down to the State Historical Society of Missouri, take a look at the Bentons and the Binghams and all their glory. Please stick around for reception. The appetizers are on the mezzanine and they will be passed around. There's a bar in the back. There's one in the library also. And maybe more importantly, join us again on Tuesday, May 12th for the conclusion of this series, which is A View from the UK. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you, man.
Good job, man.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, dude. Thank you very much.